So we meet at a time of war, with the war in Ukraine raging, with the war in the Israel region, if I could say, in Gaza and in Lebanon, and potentially a wider war growing horrifically before our eyes. And believe it or not, open talk of war with China, albeit not till 2027, we're told by the US Navy, but we're told by the US Navy, prepare for war by 2027. In my view, this is a kind of madness, I'm sorry to say. Too much war, too little diplomacy, too little realization by American foreign policy of the realities of our day, the limits of US power, and the true US national interest, which is not being served by any of these wars. And so the question before us is what is the essence of these conflicts, and how might the elections change US policy? I think it's right to say that within certain parameters, US foreign policy has shown a great consistency across administrations dating back at least to the early 1990s. Trump is a partial exception to that, but I would not in any way exaggerate the exceptionality of Trump. But broadly speaking, the foreign policy of Bush, Obama, well, even let me start earlier. I would say Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden has been rather consistent in the Middle East. It's been consistent in Eastern Europe and vis-a-vis Ukraine. And it's been fairly consistent and not partisan with regard to China. It has been overall, in my view, a terrible 30 years of US foreign policy, grievously misguided. We have engaged in nonstop wars that made no sense, that cost trillions of dollars, that brought absolutely no security to the United States and no benefit, certainly to the places where these wars were conducted. And so it behooves us to ask what really is happening in all of this. I think the answer for me, which has a bit of a personal ring to it as well, because my work with the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, and then with President Yeltsin and President Kuchma of newly independent Ukraine, dates back more than 30 years. And I watched even then in some bewilderment as to how the United States was regarding the tumultuous events of the end of the 1980s and early 1990s. In my interpretation at the time and until today, the Soviet Union first and then Russia said we want to end the conflict. In fact, we want to end the period of communist ideology. We want to return to normalcy. We want to return to good relations with the United States and with the rest of the world. And the United States had a different idea, which is we won, you lost. Now you do as we say, and we will do as we like. And we know from many accounts, one especially insightful and pungent of Wesley Clark, that already in the early 1990s, what would be called the neocon group already had decided on several wars of choice, because their intent was to eliminate the former Soviet allies and the continuing the continuing Russian allies. And so already wars of choice were being concocted by the early 1990s. We also know that by 1994, a decision was taken in the Clinton administration to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine, completely contrary to the solemn promises repeated often to President Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward, which was, of course, the term that was used by Secretary of State James Baker in 1990, February 9, to President Gorbachev, and saying that the US would not take advantage of the Soviet Union or threaten its security in the context of German reunification and Gorbachev's disbandment of the Warsaw Pact military alliance. Of course, the US cheated. By 1992, a new ideology had taken hold in the United States government, and that was that the US was now the sole superpower, unchallenged and essentially unchallengeable, and that the US would now be able to do what it wants, where it wants, throughout the world. Of course, China was not on the radar screen. Russia was viewed, as would later be the quip, as a gas station with nuclear weapons. It was viewed as a defunct and moribund economy that never could challenge the United States again. And unipolarity meant a global responsibility for the United States. And of course, the neocons immediately, in the context of peace, called for a massive military buildup for the purpose of being the world's colossus. And the most famous representation of this, of course, was the Project for a New American Century, and a document at the end of the 1990s called Rebuilding America's Defenses, which explicitly called for America's constabulary responsibilities. In other words, yes, we would be the policemen of the world. And that document already envisioned many wars and many conflicts in which the US would be involved, but this would be the price to pay for US unipolarity, and the benefits of US unipolarity would be vast for the United States and for the world. So to my mind, this is the basis of what we see in Ukraine, what we see in the Middle East, and what we see in East Asia. Foreign policy does not change very much administration to administration. Sometimes this is called America's grand strategy. For example, my former colleague at Harvard and then senior US diplomat Robert Blackwell has described America's grand strategy as global dominance or global hegemony. And he has been unabashed in saying that is the US strategy and should be the US strategy. And that means opposing any regional power that could threaten the United States' interests, even within their own respective regions. So in this doctrine of the neocons of global hegemony or unipolarity, or what the Defense Department early on in this period called full spectrum dominance, it's the responsibility of the US to dominate every region of the world and to prevent any regional power from dominating its own respective region, whether that regional power does or does not threaten the United States directly. Well, the biggest foe in this point of view early on was still Russia, though it was weak and in financial crisis. The United States regarded it as large and worthy of dismemberment, or decolonization as the term went. And so the CIA and the other agencies of the US government worked on increasingly surrounding Russia with pro-US regimes, and on the NATO front, starting in 1994, surrounding Russia with an expanded NATO military system and alliance. This became especially threatening in 2002 when the United States unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty and began placing anti-ballistic missile systems, the Aegis systems, in Eastern Europe close to Russia, starting in Poland and then in Romania. Well, I won't belabor the point, but all of this meant that NATO continued to enlarge. First 3 countries in 1999, 7 more countries in 2004, including the Baltic states, including the Black Sea countries of Romania and Bulgaria, including Slovenia and Slovakia. Putin said, stop this, stop it absolutely. Do not go to Ukraine and Georgia. But the United States pushed ahead. And to facilitate that, in February 2014, the United States overthrew or participated in the violent coup that brought down the government of Viktor Yanukovych and installed a Ukrainian regime intent on NATO expansion. And that has brought us to the present war. Well, in the Middle East, I would say the situation is similar, although probably more led by Israel than us leading Israel. Israel came to understand and believe that it had the full backing of the United States to enforce its increasing military dominance over the region, over the Arab region. The only potential threat was seen to be Iran, because Iran stood outside the U.S. security system, but much of the rest of the world was either directly subordinate to the U.S. in military terms or had no military power of its own. And Israel came to understand that with this new neocon ideology, there were really no constraints on Israel's behavior. This, in addition to, I would say, cultural and sociological changes in Israel, the rise of an extremist religious movement, which is not small and is a fervent biblical fundamentalism, Israel adopted a position that it was the regional hegemon, of course, the only nuclear power in the region, and that it would claim all of the territory of Israel and the occupied lands to create a greater Israel. And this has not been hidden from view. And when anyone challenged that assumption, like Yitzhak Rabin, he was killed. And by 2000, there was no open opposition really to this extremist ideology of a greater Israel, dominating the Palestinian people, occupying and perhaps annexing the Palestinian lands en masse, ethnic cleansing, or whatever else would be taken to assert Israel's full control over Palestine. The idea, of course, which you know better than anybody, the idea was that the U.S. could buy off all relevant opposition, divide the Arab world, suppress the Palestinian voice, and eventually, one way or another, defeat Iran. And part of that defeat would come through comprehensive sanctions to crush the Iranian economy. So what we see in the Middle East is a similar arrogance and hubris that now dates back 30 years, but it's now an extraordinarily violent hubris because millions of people do not want to be suppressed in this way. Now, the problem with the whole U.S. Foreign policy over the last 30 years is that it is not only illegal from the standpoint of international law, not only in violation of the UN Charter in countless ways, not only unsuccessful on the ground in occupations of conquered places such as Iraq and Afghanistan, not only unable to achieve military objectives in Libya and Syria and Ukraine, but actually completely out of touch with changing global realities. And the most important change in global reality, of course, is the rise of China, which means that the US has, let's say, to use the Washington language, a peer competitor that is absolutely capable of challenging the United States. But also we see that the estimations of Russia were wildly off the mark, and Russia, frankly, was having none of it. And I would say the growing power and geopolitical weight of many other regional powers, and India becoming a superpower in its own right, further changed the scene. There is no such thing as unipolarity. The United States is not the indispensable country. It represents 4.1% of the world population. It's very powerful. It has allies. It suborns many other countries. It threatens many other countries. It controls the military supply chains of many other countries. It has 750 military bases in 80 countries around the world, but it is not the sole superpower. Russia, China, and I would say India are superpowers, and there are many regional powers. Iran, certainly, Brazil, and several others that one could add as well. So during this neocon period, with trillions of dollars wasted in useless wars, mass destruction, dangerous direct war, I would say, with Russia, with the world's largest nuclear superpower in terms of nuclear weapons at hand, the United States vastly overplayed its hand. So what does all of this mean for today? First, it means that the US foreign policy should dramatically recalibrate. We should stop the NATO enlargement to Ukraine, to save Ukraine first and foremost. Ukraine is being destroyed, and I mean demographically destroyed as well as geographically on the battlefield. We're not saving Ukraine, we are destroying Ukraine through this hubris. Second, in Israel and the Middle East, the only feasible solution is to go to the root cause of this conflict, and that is for Palestine to have its political rights, its self-determination, and a state of Palestine living alongside the state of Israel. I'm convinced, as I work and breathe in the UN every day, that this has the overwhelming support of the world community, except for Israel, which it will never accept, so it has to be imposed, and the United States, which has unconditionally backed Israel in its greater Israel delusions, and but that the world community absolutely understands there can be no peace in the Middle East until there is a state of Palestine. I argue, by the way, for Palestine to be recognized immediately as the 194th UN member state, to have its borders on the 4th of June, 1967, to have its capital in East Jerusalem, to have control over the Islamic holy sites, and to have the UN Security Council impose that by international law. It has the power to do that. One country stands in the way, and that is the United States, which used its veto recently to prevent Palestine's membership in the United Nations. So the final question, and then I will turn it back to you, is whether the elections will make any difference. In 2017, in an interview with Le Figaro, President Putin made an observation from Russia's point of view that I think was interesting and is interesting. He said that he, by then, had dealt with 3 US presidents. He said they come into office with ideas, but then men in dark suits and blue ties come to tell them how the world is, and somehow those ideas disappear. And that, I think, is unfortunately a fair reflection. We have a consistent foreign policy that is this US security state. It is consistent across parties. Often the personnel remain the same across all the administrations. Whether we break out of this doesn't depend so much on an election, in my view, but rather on a recognition that 30 years of American foreign policy have endangered us tremendously, brought the world to just 90 seconds to midnight in terms of nuclear war, according to the doomsday clock, have cost trillions of dollars, have helped to increase the debt of the United States to 100% of GDP, and are bringing the risk of World War III every day until this gets under control. So I'm hoping that whoever is elected can reflect on the fact that we have now had 30 years of foreign policy debacle, rather than using the cooperation of Russia in 1992 as an opportunity for a new era of peace and entering into peaceful and cooperative relations with China. Our foreign policy is still geared towards hegemony. It's delusional, it's anachronistic, and it's extraordinarily dangerous. In my view, the most important thing we can do for our own security in the new administration is to understand that it is diplomacy and cooperation that is our most urgent task.